each of the parables of Jesus have a certain dress to them. We've talked before about historical background, so important for interpreting the biblical text because it's just all over the place. It's just not our world, so we have to bring to the table things appropriate from the background for us to understand. There are some dangers with that, but there's too many pluses to just disregard the principle of historical background. Jesus puts his parables in a certain dress. Now, partly it's to minister to the people of his day. He wanted to speak to everybody. I guess in that sense you could say he's very democratic in the kinds of things that he chooses to talk about. Kenneth Bailey, a name I've mentioned before, is the one that helps us probably the most with this, in that he understands the Middle East better than most of us and says that what we would sometimes miss can be picked up through instruction because of how their world was. I jotted down 5 things that might be at stake, issues at stake, by recognizing the dress of the parable, the historical background of the parable. And again, every text has to be taken on its own merit. You have to decide how important the background is to that particular story. Sometimes it matters a lot to its interpretation, sometimes not so much. But let me say this. Particularly, number one, where the parable flies from what I would call from true to life to fantasy. Now, we've developed that idea before, but the parable starts out in true to life comparisons. Okay, this makes sense. This is how reality is. But at some point, the parable will often fly to kind of a imaginary, weird world. That's not the way it would be, sort of breaking a syllogism down. The prodigal son is a sinner. All sinners will be punished. Therefore, the prodigal is forgiven and has a party thrown in his honor. Whoa. That's not how a syllogism works. You got a premise 1, premise 2, and conclusion. But the conclusion gets broken. And it's partly because of what we understand about the historical background. In other words, Jesus has some liberty, A, because he's the Son of God. He can ad-lib this if he wants to. But B, because he's intending to start out in reality. That would be the historical background, things they would understand of the day. But then he's purposely going to move us to a different kind of world because in part, he's trying to create that different world. We call it ultimately the new heaven and the new earth. So that's one thing. Whenever the parable moves from the true to life to fantasy, that's where we've got to have to pay very good attention to the historical background, or what I call the dress of the parable. A second place where it matters is culturally, we're just unable to hear this at times. And I suppose it's best illustrated once again in the parable of the prodigal son, but I've already pointed out that when the young boy comes to his father and says, "Give me my share of the estate," that people would have been shocked because you just didn't bring such a shame on your father. He's asking the dad to be dead. So that would be Luke 15, verse 12. But there's a couple other verses in the parable that would be similar. In the next verse, verse 13, not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. Is there some historical background here? Is there some dress of the parable that's very important for us to know? Well, actually, it comes in 2 words. Now, most generally, when we're looking at the parables of Jesus, since they're narratives, they're stories, the plot is what matters more than the individual words. But Jesus can embed some significant words in the midst of his stories and plots that will help us with background. For instance, this word far country. The prodigal went into a far country. It's the Greek word makron. And for Luke, it's a very significant word. In fact, in the very next chapter, Lazarus and the rich man's story, the rich man will look up from Hades, is what it says literally, and he will be makron, far away from where Lazarus is seated at the, if you will, the lap of Abraham in heaven. This is the word that Paul will use to talk about how we Gentiles were far away and we were brought near by the blood of Christ. So that little word is kind of a theological word that far country to us just means far country. But it's a little piece of the historical background that makes a theological statement. Likewise, the word squandered. The word squandered is the key word to this story. At least it's the key word to the story as far as the label goes. We call this the parable of the prodigal. A lot of people don't even know what that means. But the word prodigal actually means lavished upon. So and it's used in a double way. And to understand the squandering in wild living, which probably really is more financial than moral and sexual. In fact, it's the brother that says that this brother of his has devoured the father's inheritance with harlots. he may well have lied about his brother. The text never actually says that. We do know that the young prodigal squandered his living, but here's my point. That word squandered means to waste. And it's used certainly about the boy who wasted his inheritance in the far country. But who is it that actually wastes his love on the prodigal when he returns? Oh, that's why Tim Keller and other people talk about the prodigal God. The God who lavishes his love and his grace on people who come back to him. So we label this, but that's where a word, in light of the historical background about how they dealt with squandered resources of the day, actually ends up making a theological statement. So there's where the dress of the parable matters. When it moves from true to life to fantasy, and when culturally we're just unable to hear it. Another one of those is in verse 25. A little later in the story, we read these words. Now his older brother was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. Now again, at first hearing, say, what's so wrong with that? The guy was out doing what he's supposed to do, working in the back 40 with his John Deere tractor. Oh, wait a minute. A couple things. One is, we can read earlier, that the father divided his livelihood among them, which tells me that probably the elder brother was there and knew about what his younger brother was going to go do. He's not just clueless. He knows how this works. And I should tell you, by way of historical background, since that's what this lesson is, that it was tradition that if there was an elder brother in the family, not just all girls or something, then any family squabble, an elder brother was to pursue peace. The elder brother was to be the one to bring a voice of sanity and reconciliation to that which has been estranged or alienated. Not only that, but when a boy comes home and there's a party going on, guess who serves as the MC? It's the eldest in the family. The older brother is conveniently absent. Now again, you have to be careful. Are we reading too much into this? But again, knowing how family dynamics worked in the ancient world and seeing what first sons were required to do as well as what first sons were allowed to get, this older boy probably got 2/3 of the inheritance when the young prodigal took his third and headed for the hills. So sometimes we just can't hear these things because it's not our culture and we need the background. Here's a third example, and that is what I call skipping details. Skipping details. I've read Luke 10, and Luke 10, of course, beginning verse 25, going to verse 37, is the story, the setup with the lawyer asking the question, what good deed must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus gives him the parable, what we call the Good Samaritan. But there's a little historical detail there that matters greatly. And it is the marker or the word down. Down. A man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and as he did, he fell among thieves, and they robbed him, they, stripped him and left him for dead. Down. It says when the priest came by, he was going down. And probably the implication is that the Levite was also going down. And maybe the Good Samaritan who comes along is going down. Now, the reason that little geographical detail, historical background, is important is because if we don't recognize it, we may misteach or mispreach this text. I have seen this text portrayed in church camp. I've spent an awful lot of my life in church camp. And sometimes you'll see this family or this group, they say, now tonight our group would like to act out the parable of the Good Samaritan, but we're going to give it modern dress. Now anytime I hear that, I get a little nervous because I think, is somebody going to misrepresent the passage? And sure enough, it happens. Here's how it's portrayed. The family is driving along in their car. They see a destitute family alongside of the road, car broken down, flat tire, whatever. And instead of just stopping and helping them, they blast on by and get to church on time. After all, they're running a little bit snug on time. They don't want to be late. And that's the parable of... No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Nobody's going to church in this story. They've already been to church. Here's the tragedy. They've been to church and come away unchanged. Church made no difference in their lives. The text says they were going down. If they were going down, they'd already been to the temple in Jerusalem to worship. And it made no difference. There is a preacher in the southwest Missouri area by the name of Boyce Moten. And he had a story about one time going to church. He often ran pretty close to the time he's a preacher. And sure enough, just like I just described, family destitute, broken down alongside the road. And he's blasting by. And one of the children in the early days asked Dad, don't you think we should stop and help him? And he said, well, son, I'd like to, but we're running pretty late on time, and I think we better get there. I am the preacher. I need to open up the building. Nothing from the back seat. A few minutes later, one of the children said, oh, well, Dad, maybe a non-Christian family will stop and help him. It's kind of like, why don't you turn the knife while you got it in there? Now, wait a minute. Wait. It's not we're going to church. The little word down is a historical background comment. Church made no difference. They've been to church and they're unchanged. So sometimes skipping important details. Fourthly, he's just trying to assess the cultural background, the nature of it. It was very interesting. Some years ago, I read a little piece that said, when we read the story of the prodigal son, we think it's about a rebellious teenager. But when that story is read over in Russia, the thing they pick up on it is the famine. There was a famine in the land. Because you see, famine is kind of a key that somebody's not obeying Yahweh. Somebody's not obeying God. And again, we have to kind of get in their mindset. We kind of have to think, put our little yarmulkes on, our little Jewish skull caps on, and say, how would these people have thought of this? So I made me a little bit of a list as to when this really matters. When is it really vital to get the dress of the parable or the historical background? When does that really need to show up? So here's one of those, and that's this. You have to know a little bit about wadis if you're going to end the Sermon on the Mount rightly. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 27, as the Sermon on the Mount concludes, that greatest sermon of all time, Jesus said, the wise man built his house upon the rock, and the foolish man built his house upon the sand. A preacher, a young student of mine in class one day, was preaching on this text, and I love how he ended it. He said, you better build on the rock, or you're going to live in a sandcastle for the rest of your life. A very effective use of that challenge. But my point is, a wadi is a dry riverbed that come a storm, a flood, it just floods everywhere. And you can understand if you know anything about wadis, or if you've lived in mountainous areas out east or in the Rockies, a little bit of rain, it doesn't take much. In the Midwest, the rain just kind of floods and spreads out over the cornfields. But in the Rockies, it can go down a canyon and just take out houses. And so the greatest sermon ever preached ends this way. And great was the fall thereof. Wow. This house crashing against the rocks. Well, you'd have to know a little bit about the historical background of wadis and them filling quickly with water and flooding for that story to make sense. So there's where historical background matters. Here's another one, a second time where it matters, and that's with wine. Particularly the making of wine. Now, I'm not thinking so much about Jesus' miracle where he turns water into wine. There are three different Greek words for wine in the New Testament. The most familiar is oinos, which means the naturally fermented juice of the grape. The second is sikara, which means you add barley to it. It's stronger drink, like a Nazarite vow. They weren't supposed to drink anything like John the Baptist or Samson, people like that. The third one is glucose. You'll recognize an English word in that. And that's sweet wine. It's what they accused Peter of on the day of Pentecost. Oh, they're just filled with sweet wine. And Peter says, it's too early. So anyway, wine. Why is that important to know a little bit of the background of wine? How they made oinos. They'd take the grapes, they'd put them in a wine press, and the Jewish men would get in there and stomp out the grapes, and then the grape juice would run down into a lower vat, and they'd put it in a wineskin, hang it out, the sun would hit it, and the fermentation process begins. The reason is because Jesus tells a parable about this. And he says that his kingdom, his way, his government, the government of God that is so desirable, is you can't put new wine into an old wineskin. Otherwise, the skin will expand. It's already been expanded through the fermentation process. And if it expands again, it will burst, you'll lose the wine. If you don't know something about how the naturally fermented juice of the grape became wine, then you're going to be a little bit lost and clueless. So there's where historical background makes a difference. Here's a third example, and we've already talked about it some, and that is the issue of soils. Now, I grew up in Iowa, and I ministered for 7 years in Illinois, and the soil is rich and deep and about 3 feet down, still black. It's awesome, and that's why it grows so much. Illinois could probably grow enough food to feed the world, I suppose. But in Jesus' world, it's a little different. There's rocks everywhere, And so when it says a man went forth to sow, and as he sowed, some of his seed fell on rocky ground, hard ground, thorny ground, good ground. It's all mixed together. I used to have this idea in my childhood, thinking that, man, he must have chucked that seed clear out onto the hard road for it to be the hard path. But I was thinking Iowa and not Middle East. So there's a little bit about soils to know if you're going to unpack that. Here's a fourth place where it really matters, and I'll just put down squatters' rights. Squatters' rights. In some of the parables of Jesus, he'll talk about landowners who have vineyards and servants who work the vineyard for him. And then other servants who are sent to get some of the produce of the land when it finally comes to harvest. Well, the reason that the guys would say, hey, here comes the heir, let's kill him, and then the vineyard will be ours. There was such a thing as squatters' rights in Jesus' day. If the owner doesn't show up for a certain amount of time, then you're excused from not making, paying him. You can just claim the land as your own. And a little bit of background for that will help. Here's a fifth one, and that's this kind of seed, darnel seeds, in a very famous parable. And of all of the ones that Jesus preached on the day he preached in parables, and again, Matthew 13, Mark 4, Luke 8, Jesus will talk about the weeds and the wheat. And of all those 8 parables, this is the one the disciples came and said, can you run that by us one more time? We're not sure we understand that one. And so Jesus says that, these plants will grow together. Just let them grow together. Wait until harvest. Then it will be real obvious what the weeds are and what the wheat is. They say, well, can't we just collect it now? Because the darnel seeds that give birth to a plant in the earlier stages look identical to wheat. You can't tell them apart. And once again, just a little farming background will help one understand the historical context there. How about this one? Let me give you a sixth one. And I guess you could just call it closets or inner rooms or something like that. Maybe at least in ancient houses. The last parable of the Sermon in Parables in Matthew 13 is verse 52, and Jesus says, every scribe trained in the matters of the kingdom will be like the owner of a house who goes into his closet, his inner room, and brings out of his treasures things new and things old. Now that's a very interesting parable. In fact, Jesus has told the 7 parables, the last of which was the parable of the Dragnet, which is a net drawn through the sea to collect fish, and then they sort them. He says, have you understood all these things? The NIV version says, yes, they replied. Somebody has rightly said what it should be translated is, yes, they lied. They didn't get it. They didn't understand it. So, you think you understand it? Let me give you one more. It's just one verse long. Every scribe trained in the matters of the kingdom of heaven will be like the owner of a house who goes into his closet and brings out of his storeroom or his closet things new and things old. Wow, is Jesus saying something about the understanding of his kingdom? In the early centuries of the church, a guy named Augustine said that he said, we read the Bible from front to back, but we understand it from back to front. Maybe we need the new, that's brought out of the storeroom first, to be able to understand the old. So closets, knowing how their inner rooms in their houses worked, that would relate to the historical background. And here's a 7th thing, and that's just hiring people. Hiring people. Like if you are the owner of a vineyard, and if you want to get your crops in, you will hire people. Jesus tells a story in Matthew 20, 1 through 16, about a guy who goes out early in the morning and hires laborers to work for him that day. In fact, it says they have to agree. What's up? What am I going to get out of this? Well, you're going to get this. The Greek word is where we get the word symphony. They come to a symphony, a harmony about what they're going to get. And so Jesus, he's telling this story about the guy who's hires early in the morning. Then he goes out at third hour, that's 9. Goes out the 6th hour, that's noon. Goes out the the 9th hour, that's 3. Finally, he goes out to the 5th hour, the 11th hour, and he hires guys. This is 5 o'clock, and for 1 hour, and he pays them all the same. Well, needless to say, the guys that worked all day are very hacked off at this, and they think the landowner has mistreated them. But Jesus says, wait a minute. They have no right to be mad. In fact, he calls them friend, which is not a good term in the Gospel of Matthew. That's a term like buster or bub. And so they said, friend, didn't you agree? See, they didn't know the difference between what they wanted and what they really wanted. But how does this relate to historical background hiring people? if we understand some things like Sabbath, year of Jubilee, trying to get things harvested before it's too late, or a storm, it really, when you kind of put all those things together, you say, okay, it seems a little ridiculous to keep hiring guys, but he's worried. There's something coming. Could it be a storm? Could it be Sabbath? Could it be a religious festival? Could it be... If you understand something about the importance of getting it done in that world, then this makes sense. Here's an 8th one, and just for lack of a better label, we'll just call it wedding or wedding customs. Sometimes the wedding customs of the parables seem kind of weird to us. Jesus told a story about this bridegroom that evidently it took him a little while to articulate the dowry price with the father. This is a 10-cow woman. No, she's a 5-cow woman, and whatever. And everybody knows that the groom is going to pay whatever price the father sets. But anyway, 5 were wise, and 5 took oil, and 5 were foolish, and 5 didn't take oil. How did wedding customs work in that day? And finally say, the bridegroom is here. In other words, they've reached an agreement. Now we're going to have the processional. And the lamps went out. All that sounds so foreign to us because of how we do weddings. But how they did them, and they lasted into the night, they lasted into the week. Knowing that helps us with the parable. Here's a 9th thing, and I would label it hospitality. Hospitality, which is a huge idea in the ancient world. Hospitality. I mean, we have a context about this. We invite people in. We put our feet under the same table. We accept them. There's a lot about that in ancient hospitality. But Jesus tells a story about a guy who comes at midnight and you don't have any bread to put before them. Now that is a real social breach. So you go next door. You said, hey, neighbor, need some help. Had some unexpected company. Help me out here just a little bit. And the guy says, I'm already in bed with the family. We're not going to get up and give you something. Go seek the stores. Do something else. Now, to us, that sounds very legit. I mean, it's late at night. It's midnight. Goodness sakes. Have some couth. Don't interrupt. But in Jesus' world, that's all different. Somebody has likened it this way. If your house was on fire, and you go next door and knock on the door, and you say, hey, can you call the fire department? My house is on fire. And the guy says, well, hey, I've been in bed for a while. I'm just going to stay. Sorry. Wow. The next day, after they see your house just in burned rubble, that guy's name would be mud in the whole community because he didn't have the gumption to get out of bed and help. Well, that's that world a little bit. If you had company come from far, hospitality is such a huge deal. I'll give you one more, and it's just how managers work. How managers work. Probably the toughest of all of the parables of Jesus is Luke 16, 1 through 8. In fact, Craig Blomberg of Denver Seminary calls it the very hardest of all parables. I think he's probably right. This unjust steward. Make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous mammon. Seems like Jesus is pulling a fast one on us. But if you understand anything about managers in the ancient world and how they had some freedom to negotiate prices with people. Okay, take your bill. You owe 100, just strike off 20, pay 80. You owe 90, just 45 will do. That seems kind of tricky and not too good on the ethics. But Jesus says this guy's to be commended. Again, historical background makes a huge difference when we're looking at the parables of Jesus. And we just have to have the right ears to hear this because we're so removed by years and by language and by culture. So paying the price of finding the dress of the parable will really matter to its interpretation.